All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. We haven't convened the UDO Advisory Committee in a little while. We've been in the background doing a lot of work that we are ready to now bring before you all for discussion. And before I kind of launch into kind of what we're going to talk about today, I wanted to take a quick opportunity to welcome our newest UAC member, Mike Sullivan. So Carolyn Millen was the D5 representative on this committee, and she's now on the Planning Commission, so is not on this group anymore. And so Mike is taking her place. I don't know if you want to say anything real quick, Mike.
Nope, I'm new. So, but I appreciate being on here. I was new. I was on the Planning Commission years ago when we were still calling it form-based zoning. So it's come a long way. So excited to be on the backside of it. Thanks.
Welcome. Again, I just want to kind of reiterate the importance of this group and in the considerations that we're making. You know, we convene you all for your expertise, whether that is as a community member, as a real estate professional, as an advocate for our sustainable initiatives in the city. We really value the contributions that each of you make to these conversations. And the purpose of this group, again, is to get some initial feedback on some things that we are considering before we get in front of council and the community. And so it's intentionally an early sort of feedback loop for us as we develop things that we then bring forward in a more formal way to council and the community. And so one of the topics, or the main topic that we're going to talk about today, has to do with making some potential changes to some elements on the residential side of the code, and really a lot related to missing middle housing that we've continued to talk about. And I wanted to reflect for a minute. I just came back from the Big City Planning Directors Conference, and so people that sit in my shoes across the United States and big cities, you know, we grapple with all the hard issues and talk about lessons learned and things like that. And we spent a great deal of time this particular session talking about missing middle, who's doing what. Of course, Meg from Minneapolis was there and kind of hearing, you know, what's happening in her neck of the woods. And I think just really the big thing for you all to be thinking about as we start to talk through these things is that the reason why we are having these conversations is that every city is very different, and the rules in which we operate are very, very different. You know, as an example, Minneapolis is a city that's largely built out. It's a lot smaller in size. They've got different tools to work with. As an example, every duplex and triplex that comes through their permitting system has to comply with a 13-point checklist that includes design elements like requiring porches and requiring certain building materials and requiring front-facing doors and windows that we don't have the ability to regulate. And we're very unusual in most cities. In fact, none of the other ones that I talked to have those kind of limitations. And so, you know, I think we're all learning. And I mean, I had some, and I won't name the cities' names, but I had some cities that are, you know, kind of watching, you know, what's happening in Charlotte and in Minneapolis and being like, you know, you're seeing some great things, but I'm thinking about my city, and I may do this in a slightly different graduated sort of way. And so I think we're all trying to learn from one another and trying to figure out, you know, we're all trying to tackle these issues of housing affordability and housing options, and then trying to figure out, like, how do I make this work best in our city? So what we want to be very intentional about is finding that right balance between letting things sort of play out and seeing how they are implemented, while also trying to be nimble. And when we see something that we might want to take advantage of, jumping on that. So you'll see some new things related to churches and some stuff like that we're kind of wanting to jump on, and then also trying to have a conversation about, well, what are we seeing thus far and what we might want to, you know, consider changing. So appreciate all of the perspectives. Please don't be shy about jumping into the conversation. And I think I'll kick it over to Alan just for some quick logistics, and then we'll jump right in.
Thanks, Allison. I'm going to share my screen. I'll be running the slides for today's meeting. So just as a reminder, we'll have presentations by staff, and we're going to use the Zoom chat feature. If you have questions or comments, please enter them into chat, and we will try to keep up with them if we can in live time. And if not, we will stop at the end of the first segment and go back to any questions that we may have received in chat and try to provide you with some answers and feedback. So today we've got a couple of topics. We're going to cover the primary topic is we're calling it the UDO residential tune-up. Dave Pettin is going to cover that topic. And then after Dave, Catherine Mahoney is going to give an update on the community area planning process. So with that, I will kick it over to Dave.
Great, thanks, Alan. Afternoon, everybody. Or getting close to afternoon at least. So just wanted to talk through, as Alan mentioned, and Allison alluded to as well, and some of you may be aware, we're working on some additional residential refinements for the UDO, and a lot of that is trying to tackle some of that missing middle housing that we certainly want to see and try to encourage and get some more of. But we also have learned quite a bit over the last year plus of implementation of the UDO, seen some projects come out of the ground as a result of some of the changes that were implemented back last June. And, certainly as we learn, we see areas where we can continue to improve and refine. And so just want to get started on some of that conversation, particularly as we look at residential uses and infill locations and that type of thing. So just to kind of reset where we've been. A lot of us are aware of the conservation changes we made, adopted on May 20th earlier this year. We moved from there, which we were kind of talking about as phase one at that time. We've gone into compact that was adopted about June 24th. That was kind of determined as phase two. And as part of all those conversations between conservation and compact, we always hinted at what we were at the time talking about as phase three. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as phase three, residential refinement, residential tune-up, but all of that is the same umbrella of what we're working on. So Alan, if you can go to the next slide. So, again, we wanted to just talk about the residential changes to dates. Prior text amendments for conservation and compact dealt primarily with those larger greenfield development projects. It did address some of the items that council referred to as well, to look at projects that were mainly subdivisions and larger scale projects of duplexes and triplexes. So that was kind of how we tackled that through phase one and two with conservation and compact. Again, phase three is intended to further refine residential options, focus on infill and small scale development, and also, as we mentioned, calibrate and apply some lessons learned after 1 year of implementation. Next slide. Missing middle, you'll hear that term quite a bit as we go through this process, and you may have heard it before, but just if there's folks that haven't, missing middle includes things like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, or quads, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, townhouses, multiplex, live-work units. So you can kind of see that gradient in between where you have your detached single family and your mid-rise multifamily stacked. In between all that is where we are seeing some of the development changes happen. I think most on this call will be aware we haven't seen as many multifamily projects, at least coming through the entitlement side. We have seen a lot more single family attached or multifamily attached, if that's the term we use from the UDO. And we have seen some duplexes and triplexes as part of some of that as well. So what we want to look at is how do we continue to facilitate that and encourage some positive outcomes for those projects in more of that infill type of setting. So next slide. Just from quick market trends, we've shared this with council at TPD and some other presentations we've given over the last few months as well. This kind of just shows the changes from 2018 to 2023. That large, kind of teal green is our multifamily. You can see that's ramped up from 2018 down a little bit here and there in 2019 and 20, but has obviously ticked up between 2021 through 23. The dark blue at the bottom is our single family detached. The middle blue in between is townhomes. But if you can see on your screen, there's a slight gray line in between the light blue and the teal green, or sage green, if you really want to get into detail. That's our missing middle, and that's our duplex through quadplex. And you can see that we've seen some variations of those from the last 5 years. Started out a little bit slow in 2018. It's up to about 100 now in 2023. 2020 was kind of our biggest year with that at 297, but we really want to continue to see that number increase and that bar become a little bit more evident in the balance of housing options that we've got here in the city. So next slide. Just again to kind of just set the stage of where we are and why we're focused on this. This is since June 1st of 2023, which is effective date of the UDO. ADUs just under 100, duplexes 174, quads only at 7, and triplexes at 26. So again, how do we kind of get those numbers boosted up a little bit and get some more housing options and housing choices, in a good context within our community? So next slide. So as we presented this out early in, I think it was back in September with TPD, when we kind of kicked this off, we had some considerations that we put out on the table that we are continuing to work through. And part of the reason we're on this call today and convening with y'all is to talk through some of these considerations, get your input and feedback. These aren't, fully baked in some scenarios. These are things that we want to talk about. And we've kicked around internally on our side and had a lot of good conversations here. We're ready now to kind of share some of those conversations with y'all as a group and sounding board and valuable input. So you can see we've got things like, do we consider townhomes in additional districts? Create some more flexibility for what we've seen with a lot of hotel and potentially even office conversions to allow residential uses in a little bit easier way. How do we encourage the stacked quads that we see in some of our older neighborhoods in Elizabeth and Dilworth? Looking at revising our ADU standards to make them just a little bit more clean and clear for folks to pursue those. Create some pre-approved pattern books for missing middle housing types so folks could come in and essentially look at a book and choose a project option and move forward with that, knowing that it's been fairly well vetted through both city and county. And also increase affordable housing tools and explore options to fast track some of those affordable projects. That's a conversation we had a really good one on yesterday with some folks that are really focused on affordable housing. We had a good roundtable discussion with some affordable housing folks in the community, as well as our housing neighborhood services. And we heard a lot of good ideas that will continue to kind of intermingle with these conversations here on phase 3. Next slide. So the first thing we want to talk about, and it was one of the options we had as a consideration on that last slide, is stacked quads. These are our traditional kind of 2-over-2 buildings that in a lot of ways can fit a little bit better in the fabric of some existing neighborhoods. We'll show a couple just example pictures from some spaces in Elizabeth that we've seen that can kind of give you a little bit better contextual understanding of why we think this is a use that we'd like to really kind of focus in on it and try to facilitate some outcomes with. We do want to create it as a defined use. So we do have quads, obviously, in the UDO. We've seen most of those have been kind of pursued, if any, as attached units. They're not the traditional 2-over-2. We certainly understand there are definitely challenges with financing and maybe some other things. And it's a project that may have a couple challenges outside of our regulatory realm that are more on the private side, but still a building form we want to continue to encourage because we do think it fits well as a good gentle density infill option, and it fits really well within the fabric of some of those neighborhoods. So the things that we're kind of working on right now, we've done some test fitting with folks in our urban design center just to understand your basic size. How does it fit well on your lots? How does it fit well with parking and driveway requirements? What we've kind of learned from some of those testing options is that a 60-foot wide lot and greater has been the most conducive to getting the kind of outcomes we would want to see and kind of create a good outcome within some of the fabric of our existing neighborhoods. So the kind of question that we've got now on the table for us to consider with these stacked quads is, do we look at these types of units with a limitation on those by the actual districts that they're allowed in, or do we look at them by lot width? So that way, if there's a minimum lot width that's required for a stacked quad, it doesn't necessarily matter what district it falls in. If it's a district that maybe the standard lot width is 30, 40 feet, but you might have an older lot that's just zoned, let's say N1D, and it's still 60 feet or larger. Is that the way we want to pursue this and look at it more from a width standpoint versus an actual kind of district by district standpoint? So I think that's something that we'd like to get some feedback on and talk through. If we can go to the next slide, just to show some quick examples. Again, these are both from Elizabeth around Bay Street. And the one on the top left is a stacked quad next to a single family. You can see there's really not too much of a contextual difference. It's something that does fit in and doesn't kind of interrupt the rhythm or pattern of the neighborhood, particularly in some of those single family areas. The one on the bottom right is two stacked quads next to one another. You can see we do have some on-street parking, which is, one of the things we're talking about, as a consideration for maybe some incentives to potentially consider parking reductions for some of these uses. But what I also wanted to show on that bottom right example is in between those two uses, you've got your driveway that's kind of feeding everything to the rear of the building. I think that's something that we do want to try to consider in some form of not having all of the required parking be something that falls into the front of the structure. So is there a way we can, split some of those parking requirements up, allow some in the front, allow some in the back? I think that's a little bit more conducive outcome, particularly if we're looking at these in existing neighborhoods, to minimize some of that visual impact and to get a little bit better contextual outcome. So I think those are the kind of questions that, again, we wanted to talk through. I do see some questions popping up in the chat. So I don't know if we want to tackle some of those now while we're on this topic, or if we want to jump into, I think the next slide is dealing with some driveway and parking requirements related to this kind of use of a stacked quad, and how to kind of talk through that. But if we want to just focus on stacked quads for just a few minutes, we can certainly do that. I think there may be some good questions in the chat or comments. So I'll turn it over for a few minutes if we want to talk through some of those. Looks like maybe Matt, Langston, and John. If anybody wants to chime in, feel free.
And Dave, do you want people to be able to go ahead and talk? Maybe they could raise their hand and then so that everything's not occurring in chat.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Everybody should have the availability to unmute themselves. I think the first hand I saw raised was Shimei. So you want to say a few words?
Sure. I'm the one person that is really a community person. I'm not an architect, developer, anything like that. So if my questions seem to be novice, please excuse me right now. But that's the great part about being on a call like this.
Mm-hmm.
My question / comment in this is I feel very hopeful around this quad structure situation here, because when you have affordable housing, on a double lot per se, and you already have a duplex and a triplex in between both of those lots, this might be a great way to expand the housing that you have, even if it's only by 1 or 2 units. I am concerned though a little bit about parking and what the ramifications of that is. I have seen in older neighborhoods where the building is raised up and the parking is below, but then that adds another floor or more height to the building as well. So I was wondering if that is going to be something that we think about. The property that we have is here on Tuckasegee Road. And as you know, we have bike lanes and not parking lanes. So that's just kind of a concern that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I think those are really good points for us to talk through and be aware of. I think that's parking is really, I think, one of the challenges to figure out. I know there's some comments about building code and some other things that create some challenges. I think from us trying to get some contextual appropriateness with some of this use. The parking scenario is always going to be something we probably want to talk through, and understanding that there's some examples that maybe don't fit some of those outcomes that we may be looking for. I think would be good for us to learn from and consider as we work through this.
Thank you, Dave. Joseph, you had something you wanted to say?
I, I'm a big proponent of the stack quad too, and I posed a question there because this is just something in general. To the few developers I've talked to outside of these meetings, I've learned that the current, like the reason you only see four or seven new stack quads being built since 2023 on that slide previous is because that affordable and the arterials is because they're it's just there's something about the affordable component that it makes the project not a good business venture. Like it's not going to be profitable. And I don't know enough about that hunch, but that seems like something that's prohibitive. And I'm not necessarily against requiring affordable units. I'm concerned that the market right now is set the rates, even though rents have gone down since the UDO started. I'm concerned that the market rates are so high right now for getting the land and even the materials and all sorts of things. And I'm not a builder, so I'd love to have some builders or people who are close to builders chime in on this, that it's actually prohibitive to creating those, and that it would be better for overall affordability to not have that affordability requirement, because the more density we can get in these infills, the more affordability is just going to ripple throughout all of Charlotte. And so that's just kind of my take on it. And I would love if there's some people that are more expert on this, because I'm come from more of a community background too, that can sort of speak to that, because I think if that has not already been discussed in any charrettes that have been had prior to this, I think that would be something useful for the planning staff to consider as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's good feedback. We definitely want to look at that and make sure it's more of an incentive than a barrier. So if that's something we determine, then yeah, we'll have to circle back and take some considerations to take a look at that affordable requirement on the existing quads that we've got in the UDO now. So Eric, I think you did mention about the lot widths. We looked at 60 on our side. Some of those in Elizabeth are like 45 and close to 50. But I think the difference with some of those is the parking for them is solely in the rear, which I think as we were working on this with urban design and trying to fit the driveway requirements from the UDO, that's where that 60 came in from. But if there's ways we can, work through some of those driveway standards and requirements to get smaller lot widths that make it work, we're certainly open to that. But we were basing that off of what our standard current requirements are. But yeah, some of those older traditional ones with parking in the back or on-street parking, that's where that lot width does shrink down a little bit. So I don't know if that's related to your hand being up, but I saw your comment on that and just did some measurements while we were talking through it.
Yeah. Yes, Dave, that was part of the question. And the comment also is, there is a lot of, in the inner older neighborhoods, 50, I think, foot lots are more prevalent, correct? So just trying to make sure we can fit or maximize, those stack quads in those areas as well. I know parking is always a question.
Yeah, indeed. Matt, and then I'll go with John Friday. Yep. Looked like Matt was getting ready to go, and then he dropped off. Maybe pushed the wrong button. So John, I'll give you the floor then until he jumps back on.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Usually I follow Matt and I just say I like what Matt said.
You can wait if you want. That's fine. There, he's back, John. So,
well, he has more
Can you hear me?
knowledge in all of this. Go ahead, Matt, and then I'll
yeah, we
follow
can
you.
hear you, Matt. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, having technical difficulties, but
No problem.
I think I like quads, and I had a couple of comments in the chat, and I think there's two camps. There's the build to sell, and then there's the build to rent, and I think if the city really wants to promote this, it's worth some study about where are the impediments. Allison responded and said now quads are going to be under the residential building code, which should be really helpful.
Yeah.
Want to make sure, fire review, doesn't sort of start throwing roadblocks in that because they're accustomed to, it may be that everything's sprinklered and so there's additional cost. The other question is if you're building to sell, have a conversation with lenders and find out what hangups they may have. Some of them get squeamish about condominiums and some of the legal structure of what that thing is.
Yeah.
On the other side, on the rental side, you've got a debt service question because I think probably in many cases you might want a guy to live in a unit and then rent three. Will somebody lend to him to do that? Or is the debt service on building basically 4 times the house that he was going to live in something that doesn't pencil? And it's probably worth, if the city really wants to promote this, doing some research there to get some of those answers to maybe help people. And I think somebody spoke to this. I think Joseph talked about this also. There are economies of scale that a lot of these builders run into where we just can't build 4. We can't mobilize just for 4 things. And so we need at least X units in order to make the math work. And there may be hurdles in those arenas. And if the city, wants to promote quads, I think some research in those areas is probably worthwhile.
Yep. Good point. Thanks, Matt.
Matt, do you think the Housing Trust Fund could be creatively used to help incentivize some public-private financing to kind of help set that kind of market? Maybe some better.
Probably depends on the mandate. I mean, you've got luxury builders and then regular market rate, and then you've got affordable. And if the mandate is more focused on affordability, it may be that the folks in the middle are the ones who need more help because the math doesn't work. Or maybe those bottom 2 groups are the ones that aren't going to work. I don't know. I don't do all the math on the financial side of things here with this, but those are just things that came to mind.
Okay. We'll go with John, and then we've got 2 more with Angela and Shemaya. Then we'll jump into some of our next topics on some driveways and talking through that in relation to this conversation on stacked quads. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, I agree with most everything Matt said. My comment was going to be, I think you want to talk to us about planning issues and planning changes and modifications to the UDO, and we don't have the right information. To me, I would go off with people who know how this works in terms of the building code and whether or not it's going to be sprinkled or not. It's a huge cost difference and what developers will and will not build. But your view on the left, that was my view off my front porch for 20 years. That is exactly across the street from my old house. And the quad on the corner was mainly entered off of Bay Street to the right. And
on the back side there.
Yeah, and the house that's now red color, used to be gray. That driveway was not there, that drive cut. So, but I think those are planning issues, whereas everything we're talking about is how do we get this sort of form in our neighborhoods, which I am 100% for. And it can be rental, it can be for sale. I have friends that live in both situations in almost exactly the same quadruplex. But I think I would figure out what can we do in the UDO and in planning to let the developers and builders build this. But unless y'all have been talking with them a lot, I don't think you can come back today with, here's a list of things we would like to change to allow this to happen. I would just support figuring what that is, then come to us and I'll vote for let's change it to make this happen. That's it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Great feedback. Yep. Thank you. Shemaya?
Sure. So I don't think the complete driving factor should be about developers and profitability here. The affordable housing crisis in this community is a real thing. And some of us hesitantly supported this UDO based on the fact that we were going to create more density and that things were going to be more affordable. And so what I want I would challenge my developer friends on this call to really consider that and consider, what the city promised the public in these days. And so, you know, I'm not saying that we need to hinder the market, but I am saying that when we think about this, I want us to think about the idea that we've told the community and the public that the UDO was going to benefit us by providing us some affordable housing. Now, I get that there are concerns and hindrances in places, but at the same time, I think we need to be just as creative as we're speaking about our profits in how can we get one of those units or a few of those units in terms of affordable housing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There's certainly some, I think, elements of incentivizations and other things we can talk through and consider as we get, a little bit more into this topic, and particularly as we do some more research with it as well as John suggested. So I appreciate that feedback, Shmai. Angela, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Thank you. I just wanted to chime in a little bit. I wear a lot of different hats in the community and also a small developer as well. And I think that this option of small quads is definitely something that should be in the marketplace. And from a community standpoint, I agree is that a lot of folks in the community, they okay with quads. It's a good fit. It looks good. I think we think about developers, but we don't always think about there are different tiers of developers, right? And so that's the thing too. We also want to give options out here. Not everybody is, a multi-million-dollar big developer. We have smaller developers. We have sort of mid-size, and I think this could appeal to a lot of folks. And then from a finance, and we talked about the debt service, but people would be probably shocked to realize that for affordable housing, we have programs even in Charlotte that are active right now. NACA actually allows people to buy a 4-unit building in the city and utilize affordable housing programs to acquire that. One of the things that we talked about too, and some of our recommendations to the Nest Commission was even allowing some of the DPA to be used for more than just one house if the person's going to live there. And so I think these conversations are happening. And I think that in terms of, having this option, it just makes sense all around. For me to do that. And then when you talk about the financing, like if a developer built it, who's out here to buy it? But then when you look at financing of, there's ways to structure it in terms of condos for selling, but I think they're positive in both the rent and the selling side. And when we think about options, we have a lot of affordable housing. We have a lot of affordable housing that has challenges in the sense of having something that's handicap accessible. And a lot of times when you look at this smaller quad model, it can be developed to be handicap accessible as another affordable tool that you don't really see a lot of that in the marketplace. A lot of our existing stock of affordable housing is always the bedrooms are upstairs, or it's usually things like that. And so I just think that this can help meet a lot of needs in our community.
Yeah, that's great feedback. And I think our goal in all of this is to get this kind of feedback today, continue to do some exploratory research as we need to, and as been suggested by a few folks already in this conversation. And out of all of these, potential considerations we're doing with residential, a lot of times we're chasing trends in a sense in what we're seeing. We see multifamily drop off, and now we're kind of trying to deal with how to better accommodate some of the things we're seeing in missing middle and single family attached. But I think the goal in all of this is to put as many tools in the toolbox as we can and make sure that they work, which is why we have to continue to go down some of those exploratory paths that were suggested earlier, and get through and again provide as many tools that we can so that when things do shift and trends do change, we're better prepared for that. So that's what the goal of all this is. Joseph, I see your hand raised. I do want to jump on to our next topic. So if there's something you can just mention in the chat, I do want to get into Travis because we got a lot to cover.
Okay, Angela, I had a question for you in the chat.
I see it. Yeah, I'll just put the link in there and you can go straight there and look at all the information. They've been around for years, and that was just one example of a product that finances for like a individual person buying a home. But yeah, I'll put it in the chat so you can go and research that.
Great, thank you. So as we talked a little bit about stacked quads, and this is something that doesn't just relate to that use, I think it still kind of relates back to some of our triplex projects that we're seeing coming out of the ground now. We've heard a lot of different input and feedback. Some folks in the communities love them. Some folks are really struggling with maybe sometimes not the building form per se, but the form of parking and having 8 or 9 spaces in front of those units where there's no on-street parking, and essentially just creates somewhat of a parking lot in front of those uses. And that's been a concern that we've heard. So as we continue to think about driveways, where this started from was primarily from looking at some of the stacked quad options and how we figure fitting those in with our driveway and parking requirements on the different lot sizes that we've got. But some of the things we wanted to consider as we look at parking and we look at, some of the feedback we've heard is, do we want to continue to consider how parking may be accommodated on these sites? If, let's say, there's 6 spaces required for a dwelling unit that's being constructed, are we, thinking about considering some in the front and a minimum of those, and the rest need to be side or rear loaded so we can get some of that around some of the back of the use or the side of the use, so that visual impact is lessened. If you've seen some of the triplexes that are coming up out of the ground and you see those cars all parked out in front of it, I have an example in my neighborhood. It is a little bit visually jarring. I think there's maybe some other alternatives or solutions we can look through and talk about, but these are just things that, again, we're considering. These are nothing that we've etched in stone, and this is why we're here to get this feedback from y'all. But would something like that be something reasonable to consider? Do we want to look at an alternative for just the stacked quads, if that's really something that we feel like we could have better outcomes to get some of the things that we looked at? And some of this is more context examples from the Elizabeth slides we just had. Do we look at reducing required parking from 1.5 spaces to just 1 space per dwelling? Incentivize on-street parking for some additional reductions. So those are all things that I think need some attention and need some conversation. I think that's why, again, we've got this group together. We don't need to solve for it today. And if you want to take some of that consideration back, and we've got another meeting coming up in a few weeks in November, we can revisit it if everybody's had some time to kind of think on it, maybe pencil some things out. But I think that's where we wanted to start that conversation out. If you can just go to the next slide real quick too, before we can go back. But this was the kind of quad exercise that we did for stacked quads with our existing driveway requirements. I know it's a little small, but you can see throughout, some of those have all the parking in the front. Some have some split parking in the front, parking in the back. Some are off a corner lot. The bottom right example is a corner lot that has 2 frontages where you could have access off of both. We've got some 50-foot wide lots in there mixed in with 60. Some have existing alley access. So these were all some different ways we figured we could accommodate parking and look visually at some of those outcomes and see if there's things that we need to work through or need to talk about providing in a little bit more of a regulatory context to drive these outcomes. So I'll kind of juggle back and forth between this slide and the next, but I saw, John, your hand go up, so I'd love to just get some initial feedback on some of this.
Dave, I was going to say, it seems that to me, the quad under the UDO, the quad generally is going to provide 4 smaller units than a duplex or triplex. And for the most part, quads are like single bedroom units. Mm-hmm. So having a car per unit, since we do not have public transportation, 1 car per unit is certainly at least a minimum. But when you get these large, like triplexes that have 3 bedrooms in them and so forth, we really are fighting the how many cars do we have to accommodate? Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest, how do we force them not to have so many cars? So I think having a different parking standard for a quad, if we can get these off the ground, is reasonable in my view. I'm not sure when you get duplex and triplex, the neighborhoods will appreciate dropping that. So I think that's a conversation for later.
Yep.
And that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, those are some of the exact thoughts that we've talked about internally on that. So it's some good feedback and kind of shows us we're thinking about some of the same things. So appreciate that. Eric, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to go off some of John's points, the thing I would add is that there should be some location-based criteria here where we're putting some of these parking typologies, because it's true that the majority of Charlotte doesn't have transportation, but there is places where there's some beginning places where there's transportation choices, so we don't want to lose or put in building infrastructure that over accommodates cars where we really should be encouraging less cars, right? So if we can get that by using one of the 6 districts, or 2 of the districts, and getting those in the right places, maybe that might be a solution too. So, and where there isn't public or less public transportation options or walkability, then we can look at some of these other typologies that allow more parking.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you, Eric. Joseph, I think I saw your hand go up next.
And I would like to agree with Eric on that. Like, just a stark example would be like, I think like if Prosperity Village, there's only they don't even have a bus, right? And they should, but they don't have a bus at all. But then like the controversial rezoning that happened in Elizabeth this past June, the big on 7th Street, I believe near Clement. That one, it passed after the developer gave away 38 units without compromising any parking at all. So basically to make it more accessible to people who were driving to the retail there, it seems like, is the result of that. And so that's a bad result. It's great that building got approved. I'm glad something came of that, but I feel like that giving up that many units and to just make more parking for visitors to the building was in that corridor where it's next to it's basically a TOD without being called one, was a bad policy decision by the council. So I would like to see in the future, in those higher density areas, even maybe where there's robust bus lines, consider less parking requirements, where you have other transportation options for people to get there.
Yeah, heard. Thank you. Angela.
I just wanted to, because unfortunately I had a meeting that ran over longer, so I'm not sure what all I missed in some of the conversation, but just looking at this potential layouts that you have here, I wanted to point out that when we think of quad, sometimes we think of the old school ones, like we're looking at, they had 1 bedrooms, but I've seen designs where they have 2, 2.5, even 3 bedrooms in each unit. So, that there's opportunity for space and folks to move around. And, I just wanted to make sure that we don't just think it's a 1 bedroom type of vibe when we're thinking of quads. I think it can serve, different folks. And, I work a lot in affordable housing, and sometimes it's one household cars, or they may not even have a car. And so sometimes we just have to think it's one of those things that I consider a tool, not only in our planning, in our landscape and in our options, but also just another tool for affordable, or just, it's more of a tool, in my opinion, just putting more things in our toolbox.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Great feedback. And I saw some comments, Nate. I see your comment in the chat about larger conversation on driveways for all residential types. I think that's certainly something we're willing to explore. I know we made some changes to it in the past, and that wasn't without some hiccups and challenges along the way. But certainly if there's other things we need to consider and work through, even if it's some of the things we heard earlier from Eric and others about it being more contextually based or access to transit service based and those types of things, I think those are all areas that we're willing to kind of talk through and work on. So definitely more to come with some of that, but appreciate your comments in the chat. And I think, Mike, I probably commented a little bit on that as well, just talking through what Nate had posted, that yes, there's case by case basis may be a little bit of a challenge. Some baseline codifications probably needed, just to everybody has kind of an understanding and expected outcome. But I think the challenge then becomes, how do you contextualize it in a way that gets the outcomes you're looking for and addresses the kind of community needs or community infrastructure that's already in place, to make sure that we're either not asking for too much parking, or we're not impacting existing neighborhoods where on-street parking is a challenge because they're in a historic district and they maybe can't add driveways to their houses, or that on-street parking is critical. So there's a lot of different elements that we'd have to think through and talk through, but those are all things that are on our radar for sure. Let's go to the next slide. Jump into the next topic about triplexes. Again, we've talked a little bit about these, and again, this is just stuff for us to consider and consider to talk through. No formal decisions on our end have been made. I think we want to talk about as we see more of these again come out of the ground, and we see them on different lot sizes, different lot types, different contexts where you have on-street parking versus where you don't. I think the question starts to come up of, are all of the N1 districts appropriate locations for some of these? Are there limitations, again, like we talked about with stacked quads, where it's more of a lot width scenario versus a district scenario? Or do we look at how we treated duplexes in the past, where we have corner lot requirements for some of these? And if all these are just, nope, these aren't things we want to go down, we like how it is, that's the feedback we're welcome to hear also. But as we talk through all of the residential refinements, we've got to kind of turn over every leaf and every topic that we're hearing from community members. Again, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag on some of the triplexes that have come out of the ground. Form wise, they seem to at least fit generally in the neighborhood. They don't commandeer the built environment space, but parking wise and other things, that's where we've gotten some feedback that folks do have some concerns. So again, are we good with the notion of everything fitting within the lot size, or do we want to look at lot width requirements or corner lot requirements for these? I think those are all conversations that have come up here, and we want to get some feedback from y'all on as we kind of consider these refinements going forward.
David, what is the Planning Commission hearing about this, just in general, from the public?
Planning Commission, I know we do have some members that I don't know. I know planning staff is, like I said, heard positive and negative. A lot of folks feel like they've been, delivered well, but we also have some folks that are coming and say they've got some concerns about, parking and, how the parking's going to work with 6-7 cars, and neighbors get, trying to figure out who's leaving, who's coming first. Are they going to have spillover parking onto side streets, or on, I've seen a few where there may have been, activity at one that's under construction and cars are parked up on the sidewalk. So those are all things that we, have kind of, again, heard a mixed bag on the staff side, but from the Planning Commission, I don't know if they've heard anything directly. I do think we have a few members on if they have anything they want to share, but that's just what planning staff has heard so far.
I misspoke. I meant to say staff, but yeah, if there's anyone on the Planning Commission that was inspired by a mistake, I'll be happy to hear if it's been.
Dave Joseph, since I'm on here, I will say that I am aware of a number of the projects that are going on relatively close to me, and I've watched them come out of the ground. Only in one case have I had somebody speak to me directly about the project, and it was related to, well, where are they going to put all those cars? I won't say that was a highly informed decision. It was just a reaction. So I will say that I would defer to staff studying of these in terms of, obviously it's contextual, and there's some places where you would put these units where you would just have a challenge if you were trying to meet the parking requirements there and driveway widths and all of that other stuff. But a more studied evaluation of this, I think, would be better coming from staff as opposed to anecdotal things that people have said to me. So
Agreed. Thanks, Douglas. Angela, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on it. So I make sure I'm taking away the question. We're just talking about, like in your highlight here, triplexes only. We're not talking about limiting duplexes, right?
At this point, we haven't had that conversation on our side, seeing the amount of duplexes and just the general kind of size of some of those. The parking being a little bit different, there's not as much required parking because there's not as many, there's only 2 units versus the 3. So that hasn't come up for us. I think we were just focused on the triplex side for now. So that's where our conversation has been.
Okay, so then I just want to make sure we get clarity, because I was going to say we absolutely shouldn't do anything about the duplexes. I think that's fine. Triplexes, I think that we have to think in terms of, I mean, we talk about growth, we talk about different types. I'm for triplexes. I think what I don't typically see in Charlotte, and I think we're challenging. I'm getting new architects and designers coming into the city looking to do things that are custom outside of Charlotte. Like when you think of triplexes, a lot of times we're people may think it's the 3 lined up, but there's a such thing as stacked triplexes, 1, 2, and 3 that you typically see up in Jersey and other places, Virginia and things like that. And so, I think we need to be careful. I mean, or maybe it's we put them in maybe certain undeveloped parts of the city. I'm not sure if we're going to limit anything. We sort of think of it. I guess, let me see what I'm saying. When we talk about limiting triplexes, like I would be caution. I guess I'm trying to say we should be a little bit cautionary with that, because I think that as Charlotte grows and as we look for more ways to save, cost effective, when you think of something like a idea, and people don't typically think of a stack quad. I mean, I'm sorry, of a stack triplex. That's one foundation. And so when we think of cost and things like that, it could be something that could fit well in our marketplace here in Charlotte.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's where we want to find that balance. We don't necessarily want to hinder delivery, but we want to make sure that context is considered now that we're seeing some examples. But if it results that there aren't any changes, then that we will make sure that whatever outcome we get to has been well studied and well looked at. But appreciate that input as well. Nate, I think you had your hand up next. Welcome to the party. Well, Nate may have dropped off, so Eric, I'll turn over to you.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, nope, there he is.
Sorry about that. So
No
yeah,
problem.
consider the residential refinement. I just hope we take into account all of the changes that have already been made to the N1 districts with regards to compact development from a design standpoint. And what I wouldn't want to happen is the continued refinement makes projects not feasible to be developed with density. And so how do we thread that needle? I would say all the discussions about an infill 4-unit quad is great, but that's not going to provide very much housing supply overall. There has to be a balance with larger projects. That'd be
I think most of what we're looking at is more based on the infill side and not the larger, greenfield sites or sites that have been kind of conglomerated together from multiple parcels. So I think our focus is those individual kind of lot projects or, 1 or 2 lots that are put together, but not the larger, greenfield projects we tackled with conservation and compact. That's not the intent, but we will have to make sure that there's not a unintended outcome where we make a change on infill side and there's some, weird nuance that affects a larger project. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Eric.
I would just echo my earlier comment a little bit that we might be able to work on, getting some context location based where areas where there is maybe more transit to, with the quads. And then my next question is, have we seen, and I think might have known somebody who's done this with a existing older quad where they take the top floor and make that one unit and have the two bottom units separate, in effect creating a triplex.
Yeah.
Has that been a consideration that might work with that smaller footprint in?
It's a good question. I haven't seen anything like that on our side. I don't know if Shannon or anybody in land development see anything come through like that. I don't think it'd be, an option that's not achievable. But yeah, I haven't seen one of those existings kind of get converted into, something different, whether it's even a duplex almost where the two sides are just, two individual units. But I think that's an interesting concept. And if it's something that folks wanted to pursue, I don't think there'd be anything that would preclude them from doing that other than maybe building code stuff, but not necessarily UDO related items, at least that are coming to mind. Douglas, I'll give you. Well, I was going to move on to the next, but if you want to chime in for a minute.
Yeah, very quick question here. We're talking about triplexes, and one of the things I love is this notion of a stacked triplex. Is that something that we would be considering in this set of discussions, or is that a different place to have a discussion? Because
I don't know if the reason we differentiated the stacked quads with the 2/2 is to try to figure out some ways to look at that as a form that we could kind of maybe nudge along a little bit, for lack of better description. So that's why we wanted to pull it out separate from just maybe an attached quad where they're, four in a row. But if we need to figure, some scenario where, a stacked triplex is involved, then, we could certainly take a look at that. But we were looking at it mainly on that form of the stacked quad versus a triplex just being a 3-story, 3 units attached. Whether that's, horizontally or vertically, I don't think we made a real differentiation on. But if we feel that that's something that might need some different nuance and attention, like a stacked quad, then we can certainly, explore some of that as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll be talking about this offline. So
yeah, perfect.
Wait, thanks.
And I do think that the way that you have it with the how we're thinking just traditional 3 lined up could make more sense on the corners.
Yeah, and then maybe the stacked one is something else that is, has a little bit of a different treatment or a different scenario. So yeah, that's interesting because you don't think of stacked tries that often. And so that's not a form that we've seen a lot of, but yeah, certainly knowing that it's out there, we can take a look and see if there's any nuance we need to think about and if it needs to be a standalone item. But jumping into the next, we've got about 30 minutes left, just a few topics left to cover. Appreciate everybody's time. This change is something I think a lot of us are excited about, and having the conversation with some affordable housing developers yesterday came up kind of just in some sidebar conversations afterwards, and they were really excited about is allowing residential uses under prescribed conditions when it's accessory to a place of worship or a church. We've seen quite a few rezonings being pursued and one just approved earlier this week where a church wanted to create some housing on their property and created a project with essentially multifamily attached townhomes. And, the more we looked at that, and we've had a few others pursue that, talking to some folks again yesterday, said they've fielded, at least half a dozen or more calls that are looking to work with a design firm to kind of get that outcome. We were thinking about trying to remove a barrier to that, which a lot of times is rezoning, because a lot of those places of worship may be an N1 district, or they may be some kind of institutional district. So our thought in this and our approach in this would be to take those residential uses and allow them by prescribed conditions. And one of those prescribed conditions would be that they're, again, accessory to a place of worship, have some affiliation with that. This would include right now all dwelling types with the exception of multifamily stacked. After some conversations yesterday with some folks, we may, need to talk a little bit more internally about that on our side and see if that still is something that's a concern, or if there's a way to maybe accommodate that with maybe there's a place of worship with a smaller lot, but still wants to get 20 units on their property, and maybe a stacked building that's of right context and size could be an appropriate outcome. But essentially, we wanted to remove the barrier of rezoning for that, so folks could pursue that more as a by right option with those prescribed conditions. Things would get developed. I think we considered either N2A or B. I don't know if we landed on one or the other yet. Certainly, we can talk through that with some of the design folks that are on this group and in the community as a whole, just to understand the maybe difference or nuance between the two. But we think this is a really kind of positive element that we can incorporate into the UDO that would allow facilitation of this outcome without that barrier of rezoning. And so far, we've heard really positive feedback from folks on a lot of different sides of this topic, that it would be something they would welcome, and I think could be a good, positive community-driven scenario. So if there's anybody that has any feedback, would love to hear it. If everybody feels like this is a good idea, thumbs up, then we can move on to the next topic. But this is one that we've got getting fairly close on having some good details laid out for. See a thumbs up from Eric. Any questions, any hands raised on this one? Go ahead, Eric.
Just a quick one, in case this isn't in one of your future slides. Any thought about trying to figure out a way of adding, since this is adding a different use for places of worship, but we have, I think currently, right, it's only corner shops or something that was existing allowed in neighborhood 1 without allowing anything new. But I think in certain things, especially like N1, the 3 districts that aren't currently used that should be close to centers. I thought of adding the ability to add corner shops or coffee shops or some kind of, other use inside neighborhoods that might be a block or 2, 3 off of a center.
We haven't talked about it in any detail. I mean, certainly, I think it's a topic we're interested in entertaining and talking through. I think there's some really positive examples of that being in the fabric of some of our existing neighborhoods already, where you've got those corner shops, and there's a way that maybe that could be done without, again, that barrier, maybe rezoning or having to have that as an established use before. So, I think that's, like you said, how we're set up now, but are there some things we can look at to come up with some alternatives? I think we're certainly willing to explore that and be happy to sit down and talk with you a little bit more about it.
Good. Even on corner lots, putting that in as, where they occur only, just something to be able to create more of this, since we're limited to what is already existing. Thank you.
I have nothing to add to that. I just want to vote for that.
We'll take that as a thumbs up, Joseph. Thank you. Angela, go ahead.
I think it's a great idea, but I do have a question.
Yeah.
Does the place of worship, because my loophole brain works here too, does it have to be operating as a place of worship?
I believe it would. I'd have to go back and check how we kind of, started to tease out some of the prescribed conditions. But I think it would have to be an active use, maybe not one that's been converted to, let's say, a daycare or some other use. But, if there's some examples where that might make some sense, we certainly can put our thinking caps on and talk through it. But right now, our main focus was the ones that are operational, and create that opportunity for them to either add some housing where they can, offer that as a positive outcome that also may help them stay on their lot. We've seen some get sold out for, strictly townhome development. I can think of a few over the last 5+ years I've been here that I've seen completely, sold and torn down and redeveloped for townhomes. But seeing this trend kind of, it's not just here in Charlotte, we've seen it. It's becoming a little bit of a national trend. And again, we're, as planners, a lot of times we do kind of follows and chase those a little bit. We try to be out in front, but market shifts so quickly. But I think if we can put this tool in there, that it would just give us another way to accommodate folks maybe staying on that property and continuing the place of worship while still getting that outcome of housing inventory. So
I like it. I just want to say that I think it's good. Hopefully, we got 100 unanimous thumbs up on this one.
Douglas, go ahead.
Four things. I agree with what Eric says. One of the things that's interesting about a lot of churches, I've done some work on this already, and in the Charlotte area, there's supposedly about 1,500 churches, centers of worship or whatever. So there's a lot of potential for us to take advantage of this. One of the things I am, those places are generally in communities. And so that does help us with the 2040 goal of, the 10-minute community. If we can put some things in these locations that are beyond just a corner store or maybe a place you get your hair cut or something that drives community there, I think there's a positive with that. One of the things I would be interested in seeing some accommodation made for is that churches come in all different sizes. When you look at Calvary Church out on 51, it's on 82 acres of land. Victory Christian Center's on more than 50 acres of land. And then you've got places like Park Road Baptist and St. Luke's who are on 5 acres of land.
Right.
They're all have the ability to contribute to this, but in different ways. And churches are not unlike government organizations, sometimes bureaucratic, and getting the process to be easy and effective for all of them may need some stratification so that you dealing with different size churches, you can get different you can achieve the same outcome, but through different needs.
Yeah, there's different constraints for different sites. For
yeah.
Sure.
And one of the things that I would also, there's a minister that I've been working with for the last several years, and back to, I think, Angela's question of is it an active church? It's an active church right now, but this minister has this vast notion of turning it into perhaps a retreat center, a job center, and wants to do many, many uses on their current campus. I would hope we wouldn't have any restrictions that would disallow them to continue going forward to create housing. So I just put that out there as something, because when you look at churches, I think the Pew survey it's like only 43% of them actually have people coming on Sundays now, blah, 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 whatever it was. The number was less than 50%. And it's the trajectory is not up in terms of their full utilization. I guess I would put it that way.
Yeah. No, those are all good points. I think that's certainly something we don't want to hinder any outcome for them to kind of grow and adapt to what their community needs are. But yeah, there's definitely different site constraints as well. So hopefully we can set it up to where there's some ways that folks can deal with whatever site constraints they may have, and it's in a sensible way that we're not hindering an outcome if it's a 5-acre lot versus a 10 or 20 acre lot or more for a larger size church. So we'll certainly take all that into consideration. And John, do you want to close us out on this topic, and I'll jump into the next?
Well, I think what you just said about taking that into consideration, my first thought is the one that you mentioned at Woodlawn and Selwyn, where the church went away and it became housing. That probably was zoned for multifamily, because I don't think it would have been developed on N1. So what prevents me from buying a house on 5 acres in N1, making it a church so that I can tear it down a year later and do what you're talking about here? I would just look at the negative side, because obviously, as we know from the UDO and from our previous ordinance, when you put things in writing, someone will figure out the opposite intent of what you wanted. And I think all the intent we're talking about is terrific. And I can think of a lot of those 1,500 churches that have enough land, they really could build 10, 20, 30 units and make a big difference. But what could the negative be? Just that's the only thing. I'd be very careful about how it's worded and what the requirements are.
Yeah, that's
all.
Very well noted. Thank you, John. All right, let's jump into the next couple topics we've got. We'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Catherine. She wants to update us on some community area planning. So real quick, we'll talk through this as a lot of you that follow council and zoning decisions. If you do, I'm sorry that you maybe do that in your spare time, but hopefully it provides some interest for you. But hotel conversions have been something we've seen for a number of years. We've taken some on even on the city side. Again, one of the barriers to some of that is rezoning. And one of the things we wanted to continue to explore is, would it make sense to allow some of these conversions of hotels to residential under some prescribed conditions? One of the big outcomes we get through the conditional process for these has been, if there is mitigation that needs to be done for any displacement, that gets identified early on in the process, and they work with Housing Neighborhood Services to, come up with some plans and resources to try to help folks that may be displaced if that's an outcome. And so, learning from that, one of the things we talked through as a potential prescribed condition would be to, make that somewhat of a requirement for housing to kind of look at it, understand what the impacts could be. There may not be any real displacement concerns, and maybe they can move forward into permitting. If there are displacement concerns, then a plan would need to be kind of deployed and worked out with Housing and Neighborhood Services, similar to how we do with the rezoning side of things. But that would all be done more at the administrative level. We typically see these conversions happen at a 1-to-1 rate. So, quick example: 100 rooms, you get 100 multifamily units. That's something that we, again, have seen a lot of through rezoning. There may be, not as healthy of an appetite to take that out of that process, but we certainly want to put it out and kick the tires on a little bit, see if there's some creative ways we can facilitate that without maybe that barrier, without that, other hindrance that we've seen, that rezoning sometimes can pose. So if there's any quick comments on that, would love to hear it. Otherwise, we can jump into the next, which is similar, but it's more along the office building front. So the other conversion, it's a little bit more challenging. We're certainly aware, floor plates are different. Building code requirements are a little bit more challenging to navigate, converting an office to residential. But we've heard a lot of in the community about that conversation happening. We've seen it, kind of becoming something that's a topic that's talked about nationally, is how do we convert some of these older office buildings? Could they be converted for residential uses? And what we considered, again, on our side, is prescribed conditions to allow that to happen in an adaptive reuse scenario, where you could go in and take an office building and convert that to a residential use, potentially without going through that rezoning process. The question that came up through all of that then is, if somebody wanted to just tear down an office building and put multifamily on the site, is that something we've taken that out of the office uses in the UDO? There were some office districts in the previous ordinance that allowed it at a certain density. But the conversation that we had about adaptive reuse, I think that's fairly straightforward in terms of that makes some sense to maybe try to facilitate. But do we take it to the next step and allow that as a standalone use under some prescribed conditions in the office and office districts, OFC and OG, maybe some of the other districts? We've seen some of that area, particularly, let's say, around the research park up in University City, where you've got a lot of office zoning, but a lot of that hasn't developed, and there's multifamily interest. So just want to maybe kind of check the quick temperature on us considering that. Not so much maybe the conversion side. I think that seems to maybe generally make some sense, but if there's big hesitation on that, let us know. But it's more, I think the conversation is, that is an appropriate standalone use in those districts, and if so, how do we kind of reintroduce that in a way that makes some sense? Eric.
I'm all for mixed use in general. So if we get the ability to reduce these mono uses like the office campus and OG, and allowing the residential, that makes sense, especially given the housing crisis, right? So that seems good to me. I know there's also going to be a transportation issue, but hopefully the state's working in that in the future, fingers crossed, right? My other question was just related to the hotel conversion piece. What is the relationship with zoning versus the use table that you're envisioning?
Typically, our hotels are in our commercial districts or our CG districts. We might have some that were in, other districts that translated, let's say, to like an industrial district or an office district, which doesn't allow the residential component. So what we've seen is lots of rezonings from, let's say, CG to N2, to allow that to then be a multifamily project. A lot of times they are just keeping the building and they're just going in and doing the upfits needed to make it, more of a multifamily workforce housing scenario. But unfortunately, the CG district wouldn't necessarily allow it. So rather than allowing that as a use outside of where we already do, which is just in our center's place type, we didn't necessarily want to open up CG entirely to residential. But in this instance of allowing it through the hotel conversion, that's where the zoning kind of hang up comes into play.
Okay, so I'm definitely even back before in the draft did not like commercial and existing in most of the cities. So getting that to allow more uses is also a good thing. Are you using, or is this with the policy map? I know we've done some pieces where the policy map, if it's different from the current zoning, would allow some of that more mixed use, right? I'm assuming that is also going to be, we're going to do the realignment process. I think Catherine's going to talk about that shortly. That is this envisioned to be, that's kind of a Band-Aid between now and then, or would this continue on as well to be able to just, help get commercial to be more of a single use to multi-use, mixed use?
It'd probably be a little bit of both. The CG allowance now is if you're in a CG zoning district, but you're in a center's place type like NC or activity center, you can do residential. If you're just in a commercial place type or some other place type, that's not unlocked in that scenario. From the alignment standpoint, a lot of our CG, if it's in that commercial or center's place type alignment, we'll kind of take care of that because we would take it to a district that would ultimately allow residential, which is the thought process of allowing CG to unlock it now in the interim. But for a lot of these hotels, some are still recommended for either commercial place type or some other campus place type. And so that's where just allowing it, regardless of what the place type recommendation is, only in that kind of hotel conversion scenario is where we were thinking on this one.
And I'm assuming this would not be allowed in the what is it called? The flight airplane overlook or that
the noise
overlay, right?
disclosure overlay.
Yeah.
We haven't considered that because we don't necessarily restrict residential in that in a sense now. So we haven't considered the overlay as a boundary or barrier for this, but that's certainly something we can talk through. And I may want to pick your brain a little bit offline as to what the concerns may be on that. Okay. Nate.
Yeah, just agree with all Eric's comments regarding mixed uses in a variety of different zoning districts. So full agreement with that. I would say love the idea of promoting the adaptive reuse. As everyone knows, they are extremely complicated to execute. So a few things to consider. Allowing it, I don't know if you can do this legally, Dave, with old conditional zonings, because a lot of existing office buildings are tied up in old conditional zoning.
Yeah.
And people aren't going to want to go through a new rezoning, even if it's by right sometimes. So considering that, and then what are the triggers to bring everything into UDO compliance if you're doing an adaptive reuse of an office building into residential? It seemed like you'd want to loosen some of those up in order for these projects to move forward. Because there's
we talked about that with hotels too. It's the same kind of conversation, tree save requirements, parking, all of that. How do we kind of negotiate and navigate to not create those other barriers where everything's got to maybe be brought up to a full UDO standard, but we can kind of treat existing things and bring up the important things, like if there's buffer requirements or, screening or separation requirements. But if there's other things maybe that are less, more of the mitigation kind of items versus, just things that maybe need to be brought up just to a full standard.
Exactly. So, yeah, fully supportive. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Joseph, I'll give you a quick minute and then we'll
I just have a
Probably
question.
skip some of the next slides and jump into maybe Kathy's Catherine's side of things.
Just have a quick question about the second bullet point.
Mhm.
I, uh, I like the idea of that. I just was wondering, is that sort of intended to kind of meet the demand for housing? Like, for example, if you put housing near where people go to work, people will move into that housing who actually work near those places.
That's certainly one of the potential ancillary benefits of it. Sure. I mean, anytime you put housing near job and employers, it's certainly an outcome that we would be supportive of. That gets to the heart of some of those 10-minute goals, and so I think that's part of that conversation as to, well, if we're going to allow it as a reuse, do we just kind of open that up and consider that as a standalone? But those are all things we'll continue to explore and probably have some more feedback on for y'all and some
I have
upcoming
no
conversations.
Yeah, and I have no idea how the nuts and bolts of that are, because as someone who's not real on the development side, but I'm strongly in support of the theory. If we can make that work, I think that would be the more of that we could get. Seems like it's feasible. It would if it can work. I'd like to see more of that.
Certain. Yeah, I appreciate that input. We had a few slides that we were going to cover, just some things that are in the cleanup related to residential. We can cover those maybe in our upcoming meeting in a couple weeks. I want to give Catherine a few minutes to talk about area planning update, and I'll take a moment just to thank y'all for your time and input. This has been a really great conversation for us to listen in on. This is exactly why we get this group together. If there's other comments or things you want to follow up offline, please feel free to reach out, and we'll set some time up just to kind of talk through some things and topics you might want to cover individually. So appreciate it. And Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate a few minutes of your time today. I'm Catherine Mahoney with the Long Range Division, and I just want to share a little bit about a planning effort underway called Community Area Planning and encourage you all to share your input on projects and programs that are needed to support future development. Next slide, please. You could go to the next. Community area planning builds upon the vision within the 2040 comprehensive plan, which I know you're all familiar with. For the sake of time, I won't talk too much about its relationship to all the other major initiatives underway, but you can see that it's the next step in putting the plan, the comprehensive plan into action. Next slide. It is a citywide effort, but ultimately will result in 14 plan documents that provide that more detailed guidance for future development. And through this planning process, we're also revising this citywide 2040 policy map. Next slide, please. This speaks to the phases of the planning process. We're currently in phase 3, and that's why I'm here before you to kind of highlight the engagement opportunity within this phase. I will mention that phase 2 resulted in the revised policy map that I've just mentioned, and that's currently open for another round of public comment if you're interested in that. Skip ahead, please, Alan. So I think we'll send this deck out. Here's a QR code that takes you to the revised policy map. The refinements equal about 6% change, and they're highlighted in yellow. Again, you're welcome to provide comments on the revisions or other designations through November 15th. Next slide. And in order to support the phase 3 portion of this planning process, we've hosted a series of virtual and in-person meetings as shown at the top of the screen. We have moved through we've completed the East workshops, and now the South are the last that will be hosted in the future. Even if you don't live, work, or play in the South, you're welcome to attend those and ask questions about other parts of the city, and we can help answer those questions. Again, there's a QR code that takes you to the Eventbrite registration. We'd love for you to sign up beforehand, but it's not required. And what you can expect at these meetings is a series of 5 stations as outlined below. And our city and county partners are sharing information about the existing projects or the existing planned projects and available programs that's going to support future development. And then we provide an opportunity for you to provide your feedback about what else is needed for that future development. Next slide, please. If you're not able to come to a virtual or in-person meeting, we have an online tool as displayed here that really creates that same experience. You we'll move through a series of maps and receive all information about existing planned projects and available programs as shared in the meetings, and then again have a similar experience to provide input on what else is needed. So I just really encourage you all to share your input. This is kind of that proactive approach to shaping our future environment, and feedback, or this tool is open until November 15th. So you have a little bit of time to explore and provide that feedback. That's all I have. Thank you for the time.
Great. Thanks so much, Catherine. Yeah, definitely encourage anybody to attend if you can, or get involved in, clicking through some of those QR codes and doing some of the web info if you get an opportunity. We will meet again on November 14th, and that's a day before the comments on the map close. So we'll remind you one more time that you've got some last minute comments on it. That'd be the time to make them. But again, appreciate everybody's time today. This is a great discussion. And we will certainly be coming back and revisiting some of these topics or any other new ones that we might have as we're continuing to work on this residential refinement. But still lots of ideas and options to consider and work through. So appreciate everybody's time again, and hope everybody has a great afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in a few weeks.